I'm Virsaviya. Been a software engineer for almost 10 years. Known I have ADHD for almost 5 years. And since learning I have ADHD, it has transformed my life, I think, in a lot of ways for the better in being able to manage the struggles I have in life, and especially in the workplace, and how to navigate that and the advantages and disadvantages of being in software and in tech. So with that said, uh, let's dive right in. I do have a lot of content I'm going to cover, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly. If you guys want me to slow down, just let me know. Um, yeah, so embracing neurodiversity in tech and developing with ADHD. So we all know the stereotypical ADHD kid. Fidgety, can't sit still, disrupts everyone, can't focus. So these behaviors are external and highly disruptive. So they were the easiest to spot and to quantify. So these are the behaviors that we associate with ADHD. But now that we have tools that let us observe the brain with a lot more granularity than we were ever able to before, tools like fMRI and EEG, we can see what's different in ADHD brains, and now we have a much better understanding of the often silent symptoms that come with it. So today we're going to talk about ADHD, what it is and its impact, what causes ADHD, so our genetics, executive functioning, and the DMN, sex and gender in ADHD, and the role of biology, socialization, and identity expression hold. Then how is ADHD treated, both chemical and behavioral interventions? And then lastly, ADHD and development and the frequent challenges ADHD brains face and how to approach them. So first, what is ADHD? ADHD is a condition that robs you of the ability to ignore impulses. It's a deficit in the brain's executive functioning that makes it difficult to regulate and organize your behavior over time to prepare for the future. So executive functioning is so key to ADHD that there's actually a move among psychiatrists to have ADHD renamed executive function deficit disorder. And that move is actually kind of spearheaded by Russell Barkley, who is the author of the book that this quote is from. This is a book I highly recommend. So I'm not going to rehash the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. Anybody can look that up. But I'm going to talk on some symptoms that are frequent challenges among the ADHD community, especially ones that might not be well known to the general population. Regulating focus. So it's not just that we can't focus. We have an inability to regulate our focus. Transitions. It's not that the task is difficult. It is transitioning into the task. I'll touch a little more on this later. Then time blindness. A poor sense of time and poor time management skills. Again, I'll touch on this later. Prioritizing. It's struggling to do the thing that is important to do right now. So I like this little meme. I think it captures the three quite well. Anxiety is everything is important. Depression, nothing is important. ADHD, I have no idea what's important. And then there is impulse control, poor habit formation. So yes, actually, we do need to remind ourselves to brush our teeth every damn time. More on this later. And then organizing and planning, which I'm sure that one people are familiar with. Now, briefly going to talk on the impact. Three main areas here: the prevalence, comorbidity, and life expectancy of people with ADHD. So in terms of prevalence, the Global Burden of Disease did a study, and they estimate the prevalence at about 2.68%. There was a reanalysis of their study that estimated at 5.41%. But either way, that's a large percentage of the population, and this is across 204 countries, and there were no differences between low, middle, or high income countries. So this is prevalent across humanity. Has very high comorbidity rates. 80% of adults with ADHD have at least one other psychiatric disorder. So that's 4 out of every 5 people you know with ADHD. And 50% have at least 2 other psychiatric disorders. So as an example, anxiety in 3 to 5-year-olds, about 1 out of every 4 of 3 to 5-year-olds with ADHD have anxiety. By the time they're teenagers, it's closer to 44%. Depression, only 3.4% of 3 to 5-year-olds with ADHD have depression, but by the time they're teenagers, again, closer to 1 out of every 4. And then life expectancy. So this is an area with not a lot of research. There have been 2 worthwhile studies in this area. One of them is from Barkley, And he looked at projecting life expectancy based on information. There was a study that was just published this past January that looked at more than 30,000 people in the UK through NIH that are diagnosed with ADHD. And they looked at the risk and life expectancy associated with that. So having ADHD is associated with a shorter life expectancy and greater risk of mental health issues. People with ADHD are 3 times more likely to die from unnatural causes, even though ADHD itself doesn't directly reduce lifespan through disease. Then people with ADHD have a reduction in life expectancy. So for males, that is reduced by 6.78 years on average, anywhere from 4.5 to 9 years. And for females, that is reduced by 8.64 years. So anywhere from 6.5 to 11 years. So that is nearly a decade taken off your life for having ADHD and being a female, which to me is just mind-boggling. So now let's talk about what causes ADHD. 3 main areas here. There's genes, executive function, and the DMN. So first, genes. Ooh. Sorry. Now, ADHD is highly hereditary. If an immediate family member, like a parent, children, or sibling has ADHD, up to 1/3 of the family will also have it. If a parent has ADHD, up to half of their kids will also have it. It's been found, as I mentioned previously, in all countries and all ethnic groups studied to date. And researchers have found about a dozen genes with reliable association with ADHD, primarily related to dopamine signaling. They're also looking at another 10 to 15 more sites on the chromosome that are likely to be associated with ADHD. I start with this because I want to emphasize that this is not a made-up disease and that the symptoms it causes are largely driven by biology. And as we saw in the impact, there are real consequences as well. So executive functioning, right? Before we go into executive function, actually, we're going to do a brief foray into the brain. One of the ways we can think about the brain is evolutionarily. We have our reptilian brain. That's our brainstem and cerebellum. It's responsible for our survival state. Our autonomic functioning. It tells your heart to beat, your lungs to filter oxygen. Then there is our mammalian brain. That would be our limbic system, emotional state, our fight or flight, where emotions are love, curiosity, fear, anger, etc. And then there is our primate brain, our prefrontal lobes, and the executive state. So these are primarily the skills that separate us from other animals, skills like planning, thinking about the future, the past, emotion regulation, impulse control. So now back to regular scheduled programming. What is executive function? So executive functions are the actions directed at ourselves, the mental activities we engage in when we think about the future and what we should be doing to get there and make it better. Again, this is from Barclay. So a total of 7 different actions we use to monitor our own behavior, stop ourselves, think things over, guide our eventual behavior, all while controlling our emotions and motivations to optimize our success at attaining our goals. I won't spend too much time on them. I'll just go over what they are, but the executive functions are self-awareness, inhibition, nonverbal working memory, that would be like our visual memory, verbal working memory, emotion regulation, self-motivation, and then planning and problem solving. So in ADHD, there is a deficit of activity and connection in the parts of the brain responsible for executive function. Now, when executive function fails, when our primate brain isn't serving us, we rely on an older system in our brain, our limbic system, our emotional center, to get us moving, to get us doing the thing. But the limbic system isn't good at executing. It didn't evolve for execution. It evolved for emotions, for priority. So unless emotions are involved and the emotions are loud, the limbic system doesn't drive execution of a task. So yes, we have that PR we have to work on. But until the volume on the emotion is cranked up to 10, until it's urgent or absolutely fascinating or some other emotion, we're going to have a hard time transitioning into it. And this is why transitions suck. It's also why we can hyperfocus. So when emotion is cranked up to volume 10, we are all in. Bombs could be going off next to us and we'll barely notice. So why does executive function fail? Obviously, they're still researching this, but one of the things that we do know is involved is everyone's favorite neurotransmitter, dopamine. So there's a dopamine deficit. And because there's a dopamine deficit, which is, the part of the reward circuit, we struggle to form habits. So since our dopamine circuits don't work typically, we're not getting a reward for doing the thing. And so our likelihood of doing the thing next time doesn't increase the way it does in a neurotypical brain. So it's kind of like trying to train a dog, but you don't have any dog treats to use as reinforcement. Can you do it? Yeah, but you're going to have a hard time. And this is one of the reasons why we struggle to form habits. Another key byproduct of a dopamine deficit is time blindness. Dopamine is actually a really crucial component of our sense of time and time passing. So this is why time blindness is a thing in ADHD brains. It kind of tends to take two forms. There's a no sense of the passage of time. Has it been 5 minutes, 2 hours? I don't know. And then there's also this, which I'm not really sure how to describe, but ADHD is spending the day in waiting mode because I have a thing at 1 p.m. This is something that happens very, very often in ADHD brains. And now we're going to talk about the DMN. So what is the DMN and why should you care? The DMN is the default mode network. And to understand it, we're actually first going to talk about the task positive network. So when researchers study the brain of someone engaged in a specific task or goal, regardless of what that task might be, there are certain parts of the brain that light up with activity. So they called these parts the task positive network. So the TPN is externally focused, and it is responsible for maintaining attention on a specific task or external stimuli, complex cognitive tasks that require problem-solving skills and making decisions, managing and manipulating information in the short term, or working memory, inhibiting distractions and staying focused on the task. That's also a function of the TPN. And then goal-directed behavior, things that require coordinated planning and execution. Meanwhile, the default mode network is, so when they were researching somebody who is not engaged in a task, who's not doing anything, when the brain is at rest, researchers expected to see no activity in the brain, but instead they saw the brain light up with a lot of activity. And so these circuits in the brain, they call the default mode network because this is what our brain defaults to when it's not doing anything else. So the DMN is responsible for internal attention. So things like mind wandering and daydreaming, our self-referential thinking about yourself, contemplating the past, planning for the future, social cognition. So considering the perspectives and mental states of others, thinking about the intentions of others, recalling memories, so episodic memory retrieval, and simulating experiences such as scene construction. So in a neurotypical brain, the task-positive network and the default mode network have an anti-correlated relationship. They function like a toggle. So if the TPN is on, the DMN is off. If the DMN is on, the TPN is off, and vice versa. In an ADHD brain, you guessed it, the anti-correlated relationship breaks down. So the DMN does not turn off when the TPN is engaged. Instead, the two networks are integrated. Imagine focusing on a task while also contemplating why your coworker gave you that look and simulating the conversation you need to have with your manager and remembering, oh my God, I'm out of coffee. If I don't buy coffee, I'm not going to have any coffee tomorrow morning. All of this running through your head while trying to focus on a task. Of course, it's going to be hard regulating your attention. So ADHD causes, genes, executive function, DMN. Those are the things that we just touched on. And now we're going to talk a little bit about sex and gender in ADHD and why it's not just a boy thing anymore. First, I guess, why was it ever a boy thing? So ADHD has been described in the literature for a couple hundred years. However, the origin of our current diagnostic criteria for ADHD is often attributed to George Still in 1902 and a lecture that he gave at the Gulsonian Lectures. And in this, he presented on some observations that he made, and now we call it ADHD. These observations were, of course, based exclusively off of European boys. So that has driven our understanding of ADHD essentially pretty much until the past maybe decade or two. Only in the past decade have we really started looking at what ADHD looks like in girls. So That said, I'm going to touch on sex, gender, and gender expression here. A quick caveat, out of the studies I looked at, none of them really made a distinction between sex and gender. So for the purposes of our discussion, I've assumed that differences are attributed to gender unless the study is specifically looking at physiology. So speaking of physiology, let's talk about sex differences. The female brain matures faster than the male brain. So if you have two kids, both of them 10 years old, the girl's brain is going to be at the developmental level of an 11-year-old boy, not a 10-year-old boy. So if she is falling behind her developmental peers, we're comparing her to 10-year-old boys rather than 10-year-old girls. And because of that, we don't notice that she is falling behind. So this is one of the reasons why girls tend to get underdiagnosed so much. Now, the other big thing when talking about females versus males is hormones, especially estrogen. Of course, estrogen is a sex hormone, which we all know. It's also actually active in the brain, aiding in attention, memory, and mood stabilization. It helps also the body produce and maintain levels of dopamine. And one of the things we know about estrogen is that it drops before menstruation, after giving birth, and around menopause. So there's this new study that just came out. Actually, it hasn't come out yet. So there was a presentation this past November at the Psych Congress titled ADHD in Adult Women, Challenges and New Directions. And Scientific American wrote an article about it, published this past January. Now, the content of that presentation is currently in peer review, but it's not actually published. However, the authors did publish a preliminary study last year in February. And this preliminary study followed 97 female college students across their menstrual cycle. Nearly all the participants had a formal ADHD diagnosis, and roughly half took psychostimulants for treatment. So every single day, the participants, three things were measured: their hormone levels, their ADHD symptoms as assessed by a subjective questionnaire, and their ADHD symptoms as assessed by an objective cognitive test. Now, what did they find? As estradiol drops after ovulation, ADHD symptoms increase. Here's a chart from the Scientific American article. So participants reported worse ADHD symptoms, such as inattention and impulsivity, just before and at the start of their period, and to a lesser extent around ovulation. This also aligned with the more objective measures with the cognitive tests. It also echoes what, excuse me, many psychologists have already heard from their patients. These findings could impact how we go about diagnosing and treating ADHD. Because in certain parts of menstrual cycle, some people are not diagnosable. They don't present with enough ADHD symptoms, and their diagnosis would get missed. So there's actually some exploration of cyclical adjustments to ADHD medication based on menstruation. So as far as ADHD risk, in males, the prenatal period is the most critical period. So when they are in their mother's belly, usually the first trimester. In females, in addition to that, we have three other critical periods that are associated with reproductive life events. So that would be puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. Also, people with ADHD have higher rates of premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is a type of PMS, a severe form of PMS. And they're also at higher likelihood for postpartum depression, as well as worsened perimenopause symptoms. Now let's talk about gender. There's a lot here that I could talk about. Could probably do a talk just on this, so I'll try to be brief. Even though the literature has really only started looking at gender differences fairly recently, this is a quote from a 20-year-old study. In comparison to ADHD boys, ADHD girls had lower ratings on hyperactivity, inattention, impulsivity, and externalizing problems. In addition, ADHD girls had greater intellectual impairments and more internalizing problems than ADHD boys. So girls tend to present with more inattentive and internalized symptoms, while boys tend to present with more hyperactive and externalized symptoms. The prevalence in adults is the same across genders, but in youth, boys are 2 times more likely to be diagnosed than girls are. And this is actually down from being 3 times more likely. We're getting better. We're moving in the right direction. According to the yes. So parents rated boys diagnostic criteria, parents rated boys meeting diagnostic criteria as more impaired than high symptom boys, but did not do so for girls, and actually underrated diagnosed girls' symptoms compared to more objective interview assessment, with the opposite observed in boys. So what does this mean? This kind of gets at one of the core problems. Not only do women tend to have more internalized symptoms, but when they do present with externalized symptoms, they're just not noticed. They're not seen. So girls are nearly 3 times more likely to report antidepressant treatment before they're even diagnosed with ADHD. Also have higher comorbidity rates. So for anxiety, when we look at kids ages 3 to 17, girls are about 1 out of every 2 will have anxiety, boys about 1 out of every 3. And for depression, girls 1 out of every 4 on average, and boys only 14%. So also, girls are more likely than boys to be asked to repeat a grade due to poor school performance. When a boy struggles, he's more likely to be evaluated for ADHD than he is held back. But a teacher who observes a disorganized female student, one who can't plan ahead, meet project deadlines, and so on, believes she'll benefit by being held back a year. And this is probably at the core of some of the more systemic issues that we have between gender in our society. And that's when a man presents with symptoms, it's seen as psychopathology. When a woman presents with symptoms, it's seen as a character flaw or a moral failing. And this is something that has come up over and over again in the literature on gender differences. So we're only really just starting to study this. And now I'll briefly touch on gender expression. When I looked into this, I didn't expect to find a lot of research here. I was wrong. I was half wrong. There is some research. There was only one study that I found that I thought was a really good quality study, and it was actually just published in March. So in the study, a demographically diverse sample of over 10,000 adolescents, primarily tweens, transgender identification was associated with higher ADHD symptom scores. And this is actually a finding that in the articles I did find has been seen over and over again. However, this association was attenuated and rendered statistically non-significant after controlling for stress and depression. Don't know what the ramifications of that is, but there you go. I think there's not a lot of research here, so we don't really know. So we talked about females versus males, women versus men, and then also ADHD and gender expression. Now let's talk briefly about ADHD treatment, both chemical and behavioral treatments. So here are some memes. This is a very common kind of experience that people have where they realize they have ADHD by trying Adderall, essentially. So while active in your body, chemical treatments correct or compensate for the biological problem at the bottom of ADHD. Normalize the behavior of about 2/3 of people with ADHD while still substantially improving the behavior of another 20 to 30%. The positive change brought about by ADHD medication is probably unrivaled by any medication treatment for any other disorder in psychiatry. That's the opinion of Russell Barkley. And when they're taken as prescribed, risk for addiction is low, and there are stimulant and non-stimulant medications available, not just the stimulant ones. Treatments for ADHD, behavioral treatments for ADHD will be most helpful when they assist you in doing what you know at the point of performance in the natural environments where you conduct your daily life. So these are important things to remember. Point of performance and natural environment, right? So there are 5 behavioral treatments I'll touch on briefly. So there's cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is kind of the gold star standard for talk therapy. There are also very specific ADHD well-researched protocols for CBT interventions. There's also mindfulness, which is the skill of pausing before reacting. We can train our mindfulness skill with our mindfulness muscle with a meditation practice, although it's not the only way. And what mindfulness does essentially is it gives us an opportunity to choose differently from our initial impulse. So if normally you have a stimulus and a response and they're like this, what mindfulness does is it helps us separate them a little and create just a little bit of space between the two, so that if it's immediately responding, we can choose a different response. Now, this one, exercise, everyone's favorite thing. This one actually has a really interesting thing happening here. So the brain, our brain forms all the neurons it's ever going to have in utero, actually in the first trimester. When a neuron dies, it's dead. That's why we have neurodegenerative diseases. There are a few exceptions to this. One of these exceptions is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is where our mood, our working memory, and our memory encoding all live in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is one of the few parts of the brain where neurogenesis, neuron creation, occurs. And one of the things that helps it occur is exercise, especially complex cardio exercise, like dance or martial arts, team sports. So this is one of the reasons, one of the mechanisms by which exercise really helps with ADHD symptoms. And then, of course, there's structure. When I looked into structure, I was surprised there's not a lot of research on this, even though in the ADHD community, it's known what our relationship is to structure. And my guess is there's not a lot of research here because it's kind of a hard and vague thing to define and quantify. However, I think related to structure is an ADHD coach. So when it comes to mental health clinical interventions, coaching is rarely recommended, especially by mental health professionals. But it is one of the things that in Barkley's book, he recommends an ADHD coach. And I think one of the reasons getting a coach can be so effective is because it's a way of having that external structure where you're not the one internally responsible for everything, but you have some kind of external accountability or just connection point, and it helps offer some of that structure that we really struggle with. And now for our last section, ADHD and development, the reason you guys came here. Before we could get to this section, really had to understand what ADHD is, what causes it, so that you can understand why these strategies are effective and why they do or sometimes don't work. So here are some tips and tricks, both for if you have ADHD, how to manage your own symptoms, or if you would like to support having a more ADHD-friendly workplace, or if you manage people with ADHD. So multitasking, of course, fidget toys, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. I have mine. This one is never far away from me. It's just some magnets. So if we think about our attention, let's say 100% of our attention, right? And we're in a meeting. Maybe 80% of that attention will be on the content of the meeting, but 20% will not. And that 20% will find something to do. So if you like give it something to do, otherwise it will find it. So if you like, this might be why like we pick at scabs or bite our nails or like pluck our eyebrows. Those are all these little behaviors that our hands will find something to do if we don't give them something. So give your hands something to do. And in that same vein, allow fidget toys and normalize having them in meetings. Know that if someone is doodling or playing with their pen, it's not because they are not paying attention to you. It's actually something that helps them pay attention to your words and your actions a lot more. Similarly to this, when it comes to multitasking, I find audiobooks and podcasts are a really great coupling to more less engaging tasks, like let's say cleaning or cooking or something like that, right? Like 100% of your brain doesn't need to be in on cleaning. So if you can split, like you're listening to a book while also wiping things down, it can be really helpful and it can make it doing that task a lot easier for ADHD brains. Related to attention is hyperfocus. So there are 3 things with hyperfocusing that are really helpful. So there's, do not disturb and focus mode on your digital devices. Then there's headphones, the universal sign for don't bother me. And then there are calendar blocks. So blocking off a good chunk of your calendar so that you can do some deep work and you don't have to worry about transitioning. Now, these are all really, really helpful. But of course, they are only helpful if your team honors these boundaries that you set. So, for example, if somebody has an afternoon blocked off, that's not an invitation to schedule over it, right? Or if somebody is wearing headphones and you ping them on Slack and they haven't responded, so you swing by their desk, unless it's actually urgent, you might be interrupting their flow and making it really, really hard for them to transition back into the task afterwards. So try to honor these boundaries, and this is one of the ways you can really support ADHD brains. Speaking of transitions and how it can be hard to transition into tasks, some of the things that help with transitions, there's the 2-minute rule. If something's going to take you less than 2 minutes, do it. Do it right now. You have that text message you've been putting off. Don't just take out your phone, send that text message. Another technique is the Pomodoro timer. I'm going to go through these a little fast because of time. So the Pomodoro timer is this idea you set 25 minutes to do the task, and then you give yourself a 5-minute break. Now, the reason it works is because, like, you're only committing to do something for 25 minutes. Or if you're having a really bad brain day, you can bring it down to 15 minutes or even 5 minutes. Like, even on my bad days, I can commit to doing something for only 5 minutes, right? The barrier to entry is really low. But then once I'm actually doing the task, I don't need the 5-minute timer. I'm just smooth sailing. So it's transitioning into the task that is the hard part. Another thing that can be really helpful is this thing called body doubling, which I'm not really sure why this is effective, but it is. The idea here is that having someone else in your space doing the thing helps you do the thing. So if you need to get your taxes done and there is somebody who is in the same room as you doing some work on their computer, productive work, not goofing off on Facebook, somehow it's easier for us to get into that headspace of getting tax work done, especially if they're also working on their taxes. Then some face-to-face time, whether that's in person or on a Zoom meeting. And one of the reasons this is effective is because it helps us access the limbic system and the emotions, especially the positive emotions associated with the task, so that the volume on those emotions gets turned up and we get excited and curious about doing the thing. And then there's, don't let it get big, because when you put something off, it takes on a world of its own, and it can be really hard and even more intimidating to do the thing. If you're trying to support ADHD brains, one of the things that you can do if you're noticing that someone is struggling is reach out and ask them if they would like to do one of these things. Like, you have a colleague and you're like, hey, you want to just like grab a conference room this afternoon? We can just work out of the conference room. That change of scenery, as well as having somebody in the room, that body doubling can be really helpful and help somebody get unstuck. Structure, as I touched on briefly before. Clear guidelines, having clear guidelines and consequences. If you have anybody who reports to you, making sure that they understand, especially as regards to performance, what they're being evaluated on, what the consequences of meeting those expectations or not meeting those expectations are. This is really, really important. Also making time physical. Literally put clocks in your rooms, have them in your conference rooms. Set timers for things, whatever you need to help with that time blindness. Also, always have a notebook and pencil with you. This is one of the things that I always do. As soon as I have a thought, if I don't want to lose that thought, I jot it down. And then afterwards, what I do is that I will review whatever is jotted down and put it in its places, whether that's my to-do list or a calendar or something else. And that systematizing my environment that way helps me to not fall into some of those ADHD traps. We're engineers, so we can automate the boring stuff. This is one of the things, like, if you have a really hard time getting up in the morning, automate something so that your coffee is ready and your lights are turned on and it's nice and bright in your room by the time you open your eyes, making it a lot easier to get your day started, right? We have this skill, a particular skill here that really, really helps us. If, again, collaboration for these things is something that can be really helpful with offering more structure to our lives. Prioritizing is a hard one. Doing something like a weekly review can be really helpful, where, like, okay, this coming week I have these 2 meetings that are super urgent. My taxes are due and I have to do this thing, and I have to call my mom and have that conversation with her, right? And knowing that those are your like high priority items for the week, it helps set the tone and keeps it more at the surface of our brain, because, out of sight, out of mind. Um, Randomizing check-ins. I'll sometimes set an alarm. And when the alarm goes off, it's my cue to check in on whether or not I'm doing the thing I want to be doing. Or am I down a Wikipedia rabbit hole learning about the history of Dune, right? Like, so that something like that can be really helpful to make sure that we are on the priority we want to be working on. And then burnout, which I know there was a question about that. So burnout is a particularly big issue for people with ADHD. And one of the reasons is because um, since we have a deficit in our executive functioning, we rely on willpower a lot more, even to do really simple tasks. And willpower is a limited resource. So when it's out, it's out. So front loading, especially cognitive demanding tasks, to the beginning of the day when you still have that full reserve of willpower, and when you still have the full reserve of dopamine as well, because your dopamine levels decrease throughout the day. That can be really, really helpful. Similarly, this is something a friend of mine does. She clusters her short, urgent tasks for the end of the day because she knows by that point it'll be hard to concentrate. So because it's short and because it's urgent, it's easier to access and to do the thing then. And then the last thing here is give yourself time to recover. If you have a really big deadline coming up, make sure that after you meet that deadline, the day or two, or depending on how long that crunch period is, are either light days or just take those days off so that you can recuperate. And similarly, if you are managing somebody, offer them time off or make sure that after big deadlines that the workload is a little lighter so that they have the bandwidth to recover and be prepared for another a lot of work. So I think that's more or less everything. Here are some resources that are worth noting. There are three in particular I want to call out. So there is Taking Charge of Adult ADHD, which I mentioned. This is the book from Russell Barkley. Really, really excellent read. There's Life Actuator, which is a YouTube channel. He is also an ADHD coach, and he has really great shorts on what it's like to have ADHD or the various ways that ADHD impacts your life. And then the last one I want to call out here is the World Federation of ADHD International Consensus Statement. This is a peer-reviewed, it's like a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. They looked at all of the evidence that they could find on ADHD and what are the conclusions and the facts that we can draw based on this. And so this is, and they do this, I think, every like decade or so. So this link is to the most recent one. For anyone who is interested in the references, here are all the things that I mentioned, and where appropriate, there's a reference in the bottom of the slide for people who are interested in looking into this themselves. And that is everything. Thank you very much for listening. And I know there's some questions in the chat, and if you have more, please ask away.
Wow, that was an incredible presentation, Virsaviya. Thank you so much. That was very informative, very validating. I know a lot of you on chat. I saw, I know some of us, many of us, saw ourselves in those examples and what you shared. So I guess we don't have a lot of time left, so we'll open up the floor for some questions. If you have any more questions, yeah, so comprehensive, validating. Let's go back to the top of this list. I think someone asked some questions earlier. So you wanna tackle some of these?
Yeah, happy to. So somebody asked about rejection sensitivity, which is a really, really great question. And I actually, as soon as I read that question, realized I don't even touch on it in my talk, which I will make sure to change for the next time I do this. Unfortunately, I don't have any advice aside from, I guess, keeping on. If anybody else has any advice, something that has helped you with rejection sensitivity, please share. That's unfortunately not one I have any good tips and tricks for.
I'll start a thread on Slack in the community updates channel so we can all like share our experience and also things that work for us. I think that will be really helpful.
That sounds awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Mandy just wrote practice and exposure. Yes, I agree. That's definitely one of the things that has helped me be more resilient to it. That said, there are times when it still just randomly hits and you're like not even sure why you're reacting so strongly to something so innocuous. But just understanding that it is just the way that your brain is wired can be really helpful. At least it has been very helpful for me. Um, Next question from Allison. How do I know if I hate my job industry or if I'm just super burnt out? That's such a good question. Um, I that's also nothing comes to mind immediately. I think there's probably some journaling exercises, and if you remind me, I can link to a couple that can help you evaluate that. Actually, somebody mentioned this in the very beginning. This is a book. The author of this book also has ADHD, and one of the things that he has some exercises in here, and one of them can be really, really helpful for evaluating whether or not your external environment or what you're doing with your day to day is lining up with what you want to be doing, right? So some exercises like that can give you a little bit more insight into whether or not you're just burnt out or if you need a bigger change in your life. Um, is never going to this is from India. Is never going to the doctor because you can't remember to make an appointment an unnatural cause or uh I'm not sure I understand the question.
It was mostly just shit posting, but
Oh, okay.
an unnatural cause of death versus a natural cause
Oh,
of
of
death.
death. Oh, that's actually a really good point. I didn't even think about that, but that is real. Um, I think as far as questions, I'm just any idea how would this translate for people on HRT or hormonal birth control? Unfortunately, I do not. I imagine if you're on HRT, if your estrogen levels don't fluctuate, and the same for birth control. If you skip the placebo weeks, then your estrogen levels stay constant the entire time. So therefore, there shouldn't be the same cyclical approach. Whereas if your estrogen and estradiol does drop, that would be my guess. Also, because the research that this is based on is literally still coming out now, I imagine there's no research looking at this for people who are on HRT. But hopefully, I'm wrong. I'm not sure. Um,
I think a lot of these are tips for each other, but the next question we have is from Arya Kim. Do you have any tips for time blindness?
Um, yes. So for time blindness, I
Yes.
set an alarm for everything, especially like if I have a call coming up or like, that example with the spending the day in waiting mode because I have a thing at 1 p.m. If I set an alarm on my phone for 12:45, then that part of my brain that is responsible for making sure I don't miss it can relax. And therefore I can actually do something with my time instead of being in waiting mode. So I think alarms and making time physical, having clocks, maybe have a clock that, every hour does a little gong with the like, four gongs for 4 o'clock. So without even realizing it, you have some feedback of the passage of time. I think those are some things that can help with time blindness. Um, Next, I'm not sure where that
Awesome.
question was.
Okay. Next one. Oh, someone was asking, you are gonna share slides, right? Yeah, we already.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, some other people also shared tips on that.
There's a
Ideas for
question.
how to hear alarms when I'm in focus.
Oh, I'm not sure. Whatever I guess you're focusing on what if you're like listening to music, then have the alarm on your phone. If I think it really depends on what activity you're engaged in for the alarms.
Yeah.
Um,
I put my phone like right in front of me so that I just see it.
yeah, if the phone is not
There's
with
a
me, then I
visual,
don't hear
yeah,
it.
sometimes, the auditory cue doesn't work for you. Maybe a visual cue might work.
There's a question here from Rosie. Can you trick your brain into hyperfocus? Like, can I trick myself into being obsessed with leak code and not online shopping? And then Juju followed up with related, how do you force yourself to do something? I think this is so, yes, tricking the brain to hyper focusing. The way to do that is you have to crank up the volume on an emotion that will get you moving, right? So it's one of the reasons why urgency is so effective for ADHD brains, is because that drives that the volume on urgency cranks up to 10. And it's like, oh my God, if I don't get this done, then consequences, right? Um, but that's not the only emotion we can crank up the volume on. Getting like if being obsessed with leak code is really hard, but you're a social person, then having somebody you talk to about your leak code every single time, it keeps those emotions of like collaboration or competition or whatever emotions drive you. It keeps them more surface, and if there's a way you can crank up the volume on them and make them feel more urgent and like so when we're experiencing an emotion, actually, any guesses as to how long does an emotion last? Any ideas? This is one of those things when I learned I didn't realize. An emotion on average lasts 60 to 90 seconds. They're really, really short. So the reason that we're like in this deep emotional states is because we have an internal script that refreshes the emotion, so to speak, which is why we can spend an hour falling apart over rejection from a job or something like that, right? An hour. um, so I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, emotions. Yes. So because of that, because it's so short-lived, bring up the emotion. Find the way to access the emotion in that moment, and then that can help you do the thing. So instead of shopping online, leak code, like I think it largely depends on what motivates you. Um, can you show the book again? I missed it. I wasn't sure if it was. Oh, okay. Yeah, Your Head is a Houseboat. I also linked to that book in the beginning of the chat history. If you see it, I can link to it again. Any other questions? If I missed something, I'm sorry.
I guess I have another question. I'll just ask it orally. You were talking about creating emotions to help you become obsessed with doing a task, right? One of the strongest ones, like you mentioned, is a sense of urgency. Is there any way to create urgency that is not centered around just waiting until the very last minute? Because that's a big one for me with ADHD. It's just like I get the adrenaline from needing to get it done within like the next hour. And so I'll just like sit around all day doing something else.
Yeah. Like I I knew I had to practice this talk, but I didn't start practicing it until today, even though I had plenty of time to do that, right? I think a really big part of the urgency is wait, sorry. Repeat your question. How
What are some ways to create urgency that don't just
create
involve
urgency?
waiting till the last minute or like
I think
that?
this is one of the reasons why structure is so important, especially because why real consequences are important and why, like, if you have a deadline, for it to be a real deadline with real consequences rather than an arbitrary one. Because we know some part of our brain, when it's an arbitrary deadline, that we can brush it off and we'll still be okay, right? Or we can like finagle something. So whatever the consequence is, have it be external to you, especially if it's not something in your control, which is why, for example, ADHD coach can be effective, right? Or if maybe with your partner, or like, hey, when I'm done doing this task, that's when I can hit submit on that Amazon order or something like that. Whatever helps with that, but having real tangible consequences, I think, is one of the ways to drive urgency, because if we rely on internal urgency, it's just never going to happen. We're going to keep waiting.
If I could quickly follow up, sorry, if anyone has any other questions, I don't mean to take up the time, but you talked also about creating structure. And I know you mentioned ADHD coaches can be really helpful, but for those of us who might not be able to afford that right now, what do you do when the person who is supposed to be enacting structure is you, the person suffering from ADHD? Because it's the same thing where I'm like, you need to do this. And in my brain, I'm like, no, you don't. You're the boss and you don't have to do anything. This is not real.
I think that's a really, really good question. One of the things that I that has helped me, and actually I got um, from Truthless, the guy who wrote this book. I love his YouTube channel. It's actually probably one of my all-time favorite ones. But there's the ideal version of you and there's the real version of you, right? And so most of us, when we put our to-do list for the day or something like that, we're thinking about our ideal version. But the reality is not that. So figure out what your MVP is, your real MVP. Like, if I don't file the taxes by tomorrow, there will be real consequences to that, right? Knowing what the MVP is and what can be punted down the line. And then giving yourself space to overachieve, but also allowing yourself to really just hit that absolute MVP and be really, really conservative with what the real MVP is. Like, don't, instead of thinking, oh yes, I can do this and this and this, like, no, you know what, for today my only priority is making that appointment with that doctor. Once I do that, I can call it complete. If I do other things, awesome. So like really, really bringing down those expectations is the only thing that I have found helpful, but it's also something I really, really struggle with.
Can I?
Shannon has a question,
Oh, yeah.
I think.
I kind of just wanted to add on to that a little bit because I do also think that there's something valid in like you're your own boss and some like because I think about how ADHD we have burnout real easily, but it's also not like burnout is specific just to people with ADHD. I think it's also part of like being workers in like under capitalism. Like we're expected to be as productive as possible. And I think it's kind of like, I don't know, through my journey with like ADHD and surviving the world, I've also like reflected on like maybe not, I don't have to constantly be productive either. So like, I don't know, there's some tasks where maybe you should listen to the ADHD brain of like, no, this is stupid. I don't actually have to do it right now. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really, really good point. And I think also in our society, I think this is just starting to shift, but there's a lot of, especially in American society, which is, you know, based off of, as I think Robin Williams said, people who were so stuck up that the British kicked them out. That's like, you know, that's who initially colonized the Northeast in the US. But there's this moral judgment that we have that if you're not being productive or if you're relaxing, that you are somehow less than. And internally understanding what your relationship is with that concept, I think can be really, really helpful. And shifting that concept to give yourself permission and grace to not be productive and to just binge that show if that's what you want to be doing, or if that's all you have capacity for on that day. It's okay, instead of sitting there in judgment that, oh my God, I'm such a horrible human being, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat.
We are also coming up to the top of the hour, so we're at time. Thank you so much for that. I will start that thread. I'm going to post it right now. So if you have any like ADHD friendly workflows that work for you people in the audience, please share it here. That would be great for everyone to see, or like any tools that help you stay focused, or any other questions that come up later that you want to ask Virsaviya or anyone here. Feel free to drop it in the thread. And let's keep this conversation going. A lot of participants today. I would actually encourage people to start accountability groups in the study group sessions. So feel free to reach out to other members here in Leopard, see if anyone wants to pair up or form groups and just kind of make sure we're forming those habits and, just motivating each other to be productive. I think something like that could really help and, just make use of the community and each other. So, yeah. So really awesome talk, Virsaviya. Let's give Virsaviya a huge round of applause. Can also emote that. And yeah, you can drop some takeaways on chat or on the thread. Sorry,
I'll
go
also
ahead.
include a link to the deck so you guys can actually see the references and the resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much, Virsaviya, again, and thanks for everyone here for joining us. We'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone. Have a
Bye.
great day. Bye.